The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. Her name was Alice, and no, I'm not being rude about her. She really was a witch, like an enchantress, a sorceress, magicianetta, spells and stuff, dancing naked under the moon, or at least so I like to imagine. "Alice," I said, and reached out to grab her arm. "This isn't—" "Don't touch me like that," she snapped. My hand jerked away from her. I had no control over it whatsoever. It simply moved on its own accord, wincing. I rubbed at it with my other hand, as it throbbed with a lingering sensation of pins and needles. The hell? She wasn't supposed to use her magic on me. Well, not like this. Anyhow, there were rules, weren't there? Alice seemed perfectly calm again, and was busying herself with setting the table. One plate, one glass, one set of knives and forks. "Why don't you sit down?" she said. "I'm not hungry," I muttered. My hand still stung. "That's all right," she said, and began buttering a piece of toast. "It's not for you." Not knowing what else to do, and starting to feel a little frightened, I sat her down and watched as she neatly and quietly had her breakfast. Neither of us spoke until, having finished her last forkful of scrambled eggs, she delicately wiped her mouth with a napkin. "Well," she finally said, "and what were you thinking of doing today?" "Nothing. I was just going home." "Look, Alice, I don't know what this is, but stop it." "Okay, you can't keep me here. I suppose you'll be leaving. Then..." I looked back over my shoulder. The door was still gone. "Alice." "So," she continued, ignoring me, "you were going home. Straight home. You were not, for instance, stopping by Becky Greenfield's house on the way." She said this in a conversational tone, like she was asking me whether I thought it would rain, but her eyes were hard as flint, and I felt a sudden sick lurch in my stomach. "I don't," I said, then had cleared my throat. "What do you mean?" Her expression darkened further as she got up from the table and began walking away. "What do I mean?" she said. "I don't know. Why don't you think really hard about it while you clean the dishes?" I tried to follow her out of the room. "Look," I was saying, "I can explain." But as I tried to pass through the doorway, I banged nose first into what felt like a brick wall. I rebounded, and it was all I could do to keep from falling on my ass. Through the door, I could see Alice seating herself on the couch. She glanced at me, mouthed the word "clean," then turned on the TV. I thought it was strange how the picture moved as normal, but there was no sound. At first I figured she had muted it for some reason. Then I realized whatever barrier had blocked my passage must also keep any noise from passing through. That put an end to my plan of loudly calling her several types of bitch, which was probably for the best. With no other option, I reluctantly began scrubbing the dishes clean. The situation was undeniably dire, but in a way, this enforced servitude was actually working to my advantage. I desperately needed some time to think and get my story straight. "Okay, I see you raising your brow there." Full disclosure, I had maybe not been exactly as faithful to Alice as I ideally should have. There'd been one or two minor indiscretions along the way, one of which was called Becky Greenfield. I hastened to add that she meant nothing me. It was a drunken fling, over and done with the third time it happened. I certainly had no intention of ever seeing her again. Now, this was true, but maybe still a little more information than what Alice strictly needed to know. I had no idea of how exactly she'd found out as much as she already had, and how much that really was. We'd had a few talks about magic, and I knew there was no such things as enchanted mirrors or scrying pools. Magic was a force of the mind, she'd explained. It lived in people's heads, If I'd known beforehand, I might have been more hesitant to get involved with her. I know people say stuff like my mother warned me about girls like you, but well, my mother had warned me, as had any number of fairy tales, for that matter. You don't date witches. But Alice was cute. We'd talked on a dating app and quickly arranged to meet in person. Sitting there in that coffee shop, I really wasn't thinking straight. I wish I could say she'd enchanted me somehow. But if I was spellbound, it was only by her big brown eyes and the way she smiled at me as we sipped with 2 straws from a cream macchiato. Did I fall in love with her? I don't know, but I liked her. And though it had come as a shock when she casually mentioned the witch thing, slipping it in neatly between a discussion of our hobbies and what I did for work, I was already committed to seeing her again. What did it matter? Anyway, I wasn't small-minded. Witches were just people, sort of. Sure. No one really knew where they'd come from, and they seemed to be a phenomena completely exclusive to our neck of the woods. At the very least, I've never heard of the real deal anywhere else. And whenever I bring the topic up to outsiders, they look at me like I'm crazy. So you have to understand, while it may seem strange to you, to us it was almost normal. Things were very good at first. She was so sweet, you wouldn't believe it. She told me she'd been lonely for a long time, and that most people avoided her. Oh, everyone were polite, of course, but in every interaction there was this barrier preventing the development of real intimacy. Scared of her, I suppose. I prided myself on being better than that. No, really, it put a swagger in my step. And of course, my intentions were purely noble. After all, was I not graciously extending my kindness to her, rescuing her from a life of solitude? Had nothing to do with her shapely hips either. I was just being good. So, we were dating. Before long, we were going steady. It was always her who kept pushing us to take things further. But I didn't mind being pushed too much. She had a pleasant way of doing it. We even went on vacation together, renting a small cabin out by a lake some distance east of town. It was her way of telling me she loved me. Little underwhelming as a declaration? Well, remember how I said witches were only a local thing? Or at least so far as I knew about it. That's because they couldn't go anywhere else. Leaving was painful to them. And if they traveled too far, it killed them. As it was, the cabin was right on the edge of whatever invisible line marked the boundary of her existence. By the end of the 3rd day, she was running a fever, and by the start of the 4th, she was unwilling to leave her bed. Though she insisted on staying out the week, wanting me to get full use of the new fishing rod she'd bought me, I drove us home that same night, scared of how pale and listless she had become. She perked up almost immediately as we turned our noses westward, and by the time I swung into her driveway, I thought she was back to normal. I crashed at her place that night, and as we went to bed I realized that no, normal was not the word. She was better. A whole lot of newfound energy to be worked off. I won't go into details, but I'm sure you can imagine. I began to spend more time at her place after that. I still kept my own apartment for convenience's sake. Even though she was dropping hints now about maybe finding something together, it made perfect sense to shack up. The economics of it, but I liked the freedom that came with separate dwellings. Tying yourself down too tightly too soon seemed like a waste of being young, especially when it was probably going to happen later in life anyway. It was a Saturday morning, I recall, and I'd spent the night there as I usually did. I got up pretty early while she was still in bed, figuring I'd leave and have breakfast at a diner in town. Things had been a little tense the previous evening. Alice had been unusually quiet, sitting very silently beside me as we relaxed together on the couch. Later, when I'd reached for her in the bed, she'd turned away and complained of a headache. That time of the month, I supposed. I pulled my clothes on and quietly tiptoed down the stairs. In the hallway, I stopped. I stared. The door was gone. I blinked, but it did nothing to improve the situation. The door remained entirely absent. Only a smooth section of wall stood in its place. "Alice," I called. Came her sleepy reply. "Babe, where's the door gone?" "The what?" "The door. Honey, I can't find the door." "Oh, that." She was coming out of the bedroom now, tying on a flannel robe. I took it away. She went into the kitchen, leaving me standing there nonplussed. After a while, I followed her like a lost puppy. But, I said, I need the door. Do you? She said, pouring orange juice into a glass. Yes, Alice, I gotta go. She exhaled mildly, but with obvious displeasure. Carefully, she occupied herself with the task of making breakfast so as not to have to look at me. I saw her shake her head slightly and smile, a very tight smile, while working. She was also clearly only preparing one portion. I'd been a little disappointed at the time. What? I'd said. Like it's not even real. People just think it is. Sure, she'd said. Just make-believe. Then she had snapped her fingers, and suddenly there'd been the sensation of feathers tickling me in all my worst spots, as I'd collapsed in a heap of giggles. She'd smiled and added, but when it feels real, what's the difference? She'd maintained the spell for another heartbeat before snapping her fingers again, and letting me breathlessly get back on my feet. At first I was angry with her, but she had laughingly drawn me towards the bed. Don't be mad, she'd whispered as she pulled me down on top of her. I bet I can make you feel really good, too. I certainly had no doubts left that magic was more than mere illusion. It was our minds that defined our reality, and as long as I thought I couldn't leave the kitchen, my body would act accordingly, and if I thought the door was gone, I would be unable to make any use of it, even if I actually stood there touching the handle. Are you now about to call me a prize-winning fool? Are you about to point out that if all of this was the case, then yeah, of course she'd know what I'd been up to? That, hey, buddy, get a clue, because obviously she was reading your mind. Psst, wrong. She can't do that. It's the one thing everyone knows about witches. Look, think for a second. With all the dirty little secrets floating around a small town, can you imagine what would happen if people thought their minds were being spied on? There'd be pitchforks and torches handed out on Main Street. The ensuing mob would have made what happened to those poor girls in Salem look like a day in the park. So no, mind reading was out, but somehow she had learned something, and I now was stuck in it. It didn't take me long to finish washing up, but I thought perhaps I might have just managed to sketch out a rudimentary defense. As I dried and put away the final piece of cutlery, I felt the lessening of some pressure behind me. The noise of the TV became suddenly audible. Here went nothing. I slowly walked into the living room, trying to put on my most disarming smile. Alice, I said, look, you know I'm crazy about you. It's you and me. Right. I sat down next to her, tried to put my arm around her. She shrugged me off. Simonde. I wheedled. Becky. No way. I talked to her a couple of times. That's all. Sure. She came up to me at Flanagan's when she'd had a couple of drinks. She tried to kiss me, and I pushed her away. Told her it wasn't happening. End of story. Look at me. She did turn towards me then. Her eyes were wet, and I felt guilty, but I also thought, Jackie, my boy. Now you've got her. You swear? She asked. There was nothing else? Yeah, I said. Course not. You're my itchy-witchy girl. What do I need with anyone else? She reached out to caress my face. I prepared myself for the sweet forgiveness that was to come. You stupid motherfucker, she said affectionately. You're still lying to me. A sound like a gong reverberated in my mind as my head exploded with pain. It was like someone had cracked my dome with a frying pan. I slid off the couch, moaning, scrambling backwards on the floor to get away from her. She'd lost it. For the first time, I started to think she might actually seriously hurt me. Stop it, I shouted. You're crazy. You don't even know. I saw you, she shrieked back. She was standing now, face twisted with fury. Around her, the room was growing dim, as if she was somehow drinking in the light. She got in your truck. So what? I shouted. I can't give her a ride. I went to her house. She spat each word like a bullet. She told me. I threatened to turn her into a toad if she didn't. As if I could. As if there'd be any point. There's nothing worse I could do than leave her as she is. And yet, you fucked her anyway. An old slut. Becky was only 35. I thought, But Alice was working herself up to something. A haze of darkness had begun covering her skin, was pulsating in time to her words. She came forwards, driving me backwards to where the door was not. "I should kill you," she raged. "I should burn you. I should make you eat your..." She might do it. She really might do it. Desperate now, still on the floor, I groped blindly behind me with one hand. It seized upon something, with all the strength that was in me. I hurled the object at her like a tomahawk. The green ankle boot struck her on the forehead with a little thud. "Oh," she said. She sat down on the couch. The shadows dissipated. Her and the room both went back to normal. For a moment we looked at each other in silence. Then she burst into tears. "I loved you," she sobbed. "I loved you." I tried to say something, but she cut me off. "Go," she cried. "Just go." Behind me, the door was once more where it used to be. It was a sorry scene, all right, but I figured I'd better do as she said before she changed her mind. Slipping my jacket on, I was halfway out the door when she called out to me, "Jack." I turned. She said something else. I couldn't make out the words, but they struck me like a spray of ice water, seemed to seep into my skin, into my head, nestling somewhere deep in the back of my brain. I ran. I left town the same day, setting myself up in a hotel the next town over. The one good thing was, at least I knew she couldn't come after me. Everything sort of worked out after that. I'd been commuting to work anyway, so relocating actually put me closer to my job. And I was able to call someone to get the rest of my stuff from my apartment. Then I got a new place, here in this town. So yeah, that's how I ended up here. Don't date witches, I guess. What's that? You think maybe there's some other lesson here? Like maybe don't cheat on your girlfriend? Yeah, I know. Trust me, I know. You think I've been telling you this because I like going over it. It were those last few words she spoke to me. They were a spell. Every time I think about asking someone out now, I have to tell them this story first. I can't help it. So, now that you know, what do you say? Pick you up at 8? My name is Jake, and this is the story of the worst night of my life. I never really believed in ghosts or anything like that before, but now, I'm not so sure. It all started on a Friday night. My parents were out of town, and I had the house to myself. I was 16, and they trusted me enough to leave me alone for the weekend. I thought it was going to be awesome, a weekend of video games, junk food, and staying up late. But things didn't go as planned. It was around 10 p.m. when it started. I was sitting in the living room, playing a video game, when I heard a noise. It wasn't a loud noise, just a soft thud coming from the basement. At first, I thought it was nothing, probably just the house settling or something. But then, I heard it again. This time, it was louder. I paused the game and listened. The sound was like something heavy being dragged across the floor down in the basement. My first thought was that maybe a box had fallen over or something. But the more I listened, the more I realized it didn't sound like that. It sounded like footsteps. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just imagining things. But the noise didn't stop. In fact, it got louder and more frequent, like someone or something was walking around down there. I stood up, trying to shake off the fear creeping up my spine. It's just the house, I told myself. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The basement in our house is creepy. It's old and unfinished, with exposed beams and a dirt floor. I've never liked going down there, even during the day. But now, in the dark, with that noise coming from below, the thought of going down there made my skin crawl. But I had to check it out. I couldn't just ignore it. If there was something or someone down there, I needed to know. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed for the basement door. I stood in front of the door for what felt like forever, my hand on the knob, trying to build up the courage to open it. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Finally, I took a deep breath and turned the knob. The door creaked open, and a musty smell hit me. The basement was pitch black, and the stairs disappeared into the darkness. I switched on the flashlight and shined it down the stairs. The beam of light shook as I tried to steady my hand. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, just silence, except for the faint sound of those footsteps. I took a step down, then another. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step echoing in the silence. I kept the flashlight pointed straight ahead, afraid of what I might see if I looked around. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I shined the flashlight around the basement. Everything looked normal, just the usual stuff we kept down there. Boxes, old furniture, a workbench with tools scattered across it, but the sound was still there, coming from the far corner of the basement, where the shadows were thickest. I took a few steps forward, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The sound of footsteps stopped suddenly, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I whipped the flashlight toward the corner, but there was nothing there, just shadows. But I knew I had seen something, a dark shape, like a person moving in the shadows. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the basement. No answer. My heart was racing, and I could feel the sweat on my forehead. I was about to turn and run back up the stairs when the footsteps started again. But this time, they were closer. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps were all around me now, like they were circling me. I felt a cold breeze on the back of my neck, and I knew, whatever it was right behind me. I turned around slowly, my breath caught in my throat, and then I saw it, a shadowy figure, standing just a few feet away from me. It didn't have a face, just a dark, shapeless form, but I could feel its eyes on me. For a moment, I was frouncing with fear, unable to move or scream. The figure just stood there, watching me. Then, it started to move toward me, its footsteps echoing in the silence. I don't know how I did it, but somehow, I managed to turn and run. I sprinted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, not daring to look back. I could hear the footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. I burst through the basement door and slammed it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, my chest heaving, trying to catch my breath. The house was silent again, but I knew that thing was still down there. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, clutching the flashlight and a kitchen knife, just in case. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept expecting to hear those footsteps again. When my parents came home the next day, I told them what happened. They didn't believe me. Of course, they said it was just my imagination, that I probably heard the wind or the house settling, but I know what I saw. I haven't been back in the basement since that night, and I never will. I don't care what my parents say. I know there's something down there, something dark and evil, and I'm not going to give it another chance to get me. So, if you ever hear strange noises coming from your basement, take my advice, don't go down there. You might not be as lucky as I was. "5 years ago, at the ripe age of 18, I moved out of my parents' home to be closer to the community college I was going to attend at the time. It was an hour away, and it would be the first time that I'd get a taste of being an independent adult and living away from them. I was obviously nervous and stressed, but I was looking forward to the freedom of having my own place. I'd be able to stay out late on the weekends, buy whatever I want, play my music as loud as I'd want to, and basically do all the things I couldn't get away with doing. So yeah, I was ready to enter a new stage in my life. Sure, I'd miss them, but I'd obviously stay in touch, and it wasn't like I was moving to the other side of the world. So when I found an apartment that was just blocks from the college I was applying to, I began to count down the days until my eventual move-in date in the fall. It was the cheapest apartment complex I could find within a 50-mile radius, and it was conveniently located near a busy shopping district, so I could basically walk to do my grocery shopping. Overall, it was ideal, and I had read down-scenes of reviews that gave praise to the complex, so I really wasn't worried that I would regret moving in. I even did a tour of the place and was impressed with the very modern look, and the fact it had a gym and a decently sized park behind the complex itself that was open only to the tenants, which meant no homeless people sleeping on the benches. Best of all, it was gated. You'd need a code to enter the premises. I also had a new job lined up that would pay me just above minimum wage. I'd have enough income to afford the rent. My move-in date was fast approaching, and finally one day in August I was set to move in. I packed away all my stuff in suitcases and boxes. My older brother Dale came by with his moving van and we loaded everything inside. I said my goodbyes to my parents. I'd promised to call as soon as I arrived. I waved goodbye and climbed into the van and we drove off. I could hardly wait to finish unpacking and spend my first official night at my new crib. Dale was telling me of all the potential house parties we would throw and sneaking me into nightclubs despite the fact I wasn't 21 yet. I really had no interest in parties and club hopping. None of that appealed to me, but Dale was the opposite. He was a wild frat bro who would constantly throw parties as an excuse to get drunk and hook up with cute girls. Dale had gotten a DUI once and had his license revoked after one particular night of heavy partying and drinking. But since that incident that happened last year, he's been trying to sober up, but he still drinks every weekend, so I guess he isn't ready to kick the habit yet. We finally arrived at the complex. Dale helped me bring everything inside. It took us practically all day to unpack. Afterwards, I was exhausted and went to sleep after he left. Here I was now on my own, well, at least I thought I would be. I guess I forgot to mention that I'd be moving back into my parents' house about 6 months from that day, because my soon-to-be roommate would turn out to be a junkie alcoholic who ran into some serious trouble with his dealer and would be the reason I would have to move out and call the cops. But for the first month, things were easy going. I was going to school and working and had a decent social life, but all of that would change in the following months, and I hate to say that my brother Dale is partly to blame. Now, you're probably wondering why I ended up having a roommate. It wasn't so much that I wouldn't be able to cover the monthly rent. I was more than apt to. I just started to get lonely after a few weeks, and I was going mad having silence and not having anyone to help do the chores and cooking. I was accustomed to that with Mom and Dad, but all of that fell on me now. I guess I was also lazy. All in all, I did need the company. Dale knew a guy who needed a place and was struggling to find some place in his budget, so he told him he could crash at mine for as long as he needed to. What Dale failed to mention was this dude had been evicted from his previous apartment because on multiple occasions he failed to pay his rent, and his ex had kicked him out due to his drug problems and heavy drinking. His name was Alan, and he was a 27-year-old who was good friends with Dale. They had known each other since high school. I had never met him, but Dale said he was really cool and laid back and mostly kept to himself, so I assumed he was chill. Boy, was I wrong. I wish Dale had let me chosen my own roommate. He wasn't the best judge of character, but I went along with things. One day Alan showed up unexpectedly. It was late and I heard knocking, and I begrudgingly got out of bed to answer, and there he stood. He was tall, maybe 5'11", and had quite an impressive build. He wore a dirty white t-shirt under an even dirtier brown leather jacket. His jeans were ripped and looked discolored, and his tennis shoes were unlaced. It looked like he hadn't shaven in days. In fact, it looked like he didn't prioritize his hygiene much because he smelled awful. He grinned at me and shook my hand. I recoiled inside as we made contact and wanted to puke, but I held in my discomfort. I knew he was going to be a major red flag, but I let it slide. I didn't want to be judgmental, and Dale was just trying to help. "Joe, chill place you got here, dude. Looks better than my one bedroom. Man, this place is definitely an upgrade," he said, looking around my apartment. He threw his backpack onto my couch and leapt over right smack on the couch like he owned the damn place. I was feeling irritated. This guy had the nerve to show up at night waking me up, and now here he was planting his ass on my clean couch covers. I was going to have to set some ground rules because there was no way I was going to have a flithy roommate who didn't bother bathing himself once in a while. "Well, it's good to meet you, Alan," I said with a hint of sarcasm that I hoped he wouldn't pick up on. "Dale told me you needed a place, so he offered mine. It's pretty nice. I don't have any complaints. I really needed to go back to sleep, and I wasn't interested in having a late night chat with this slob, so I was just going to retreat back to my room and let him sleep out here. There wasn't a spare bedroom. I hadn't thought to get a 2-bedroom, as they were way more expensive, and I wasn't sure if I could rely on Alan to help with the rent, but in hindsight, I didn't know that he wasn't going to be any sort of help at all. Alan put up his feet on one of the pillows and stretched his arms behind his head. He was adjusting quite well to his new living arrangements. He seemed like the type to have a disregard for people's living spaces. That was something that just really got under my skin and made me curse under my breath. Appreciate it, man. Your bro is a real one. Oh, he's also going to bring the rest of my stuff tomorrow. And look, I won't give you too much trouble. I lived alone once too. It has its pros and cons, but it's not so bad. He looked at me with a pathetic grin, as though waiting for a response. I just gave a slight nod and told him I was going to sleep. I turned to walk back, hoping that I could get a good night's rest, but I got the impression that Alan was a night owl, which would be another red flag. A few hours into me being asleep, I heard faint knocking. I raised my head a little and propped myself up by the arm and got out of bed. I walked over to the door and opened it to see Alan holding a bottle of Hennessy. I could make out a look of unease in his eyes. He looked so nonchalant before, but now I could tell he was nervous, but I didn't want to rush to any conclusions. I barely knew the guy anyway, and Dale wasn't very transparent about his friendship with Alan. Listen, man, I gotta bounce. One of my buddies just hit me up. I gotta meet him in 10. I'll see you later, bro. Tell Dale he can leave my stuff here, he said with a hushed but rushed voice, and with that Alan buzzed out of the apartment. I didn't care where he was going. He was a grown man after all, and I wasn't going to set a curfew on someone pushing 30, but I couldn't help but feel a bit suspicious. I pushed my thoughts to the back of my head and went to sleep. If Alan gave me any problems, I'd kick him to the curb, and I really did want to throw his stuff out and tell him to find another place, but I felt somewhat bad for the dude. I guess I was just going to have to welcome my new roommate with open arms. The next day I woke up to start my day. I had a few classes today, but I wasn't in much of a hurry. It was already 9:30 a.m. I walked to the kitchen to make myself some breakfast. I didn't see Alan. Maybe he lost track of time or something last night. I went about my normal routine and tried not to think too much about Alan and his whereabouts. It wasn't my business. When I finished the last class of the day, I headed back to do some studying. I unlocked the apartment and poked my head inside, and to my shock, I saw bottles all over the coffee table. Alan must have shown up and decided to leave a welcome gift. I called out his name, but there was no response. He didn't bother to clean up his crap. There was no way I was going to let him trash the place, so I went to grab a trash bag and tossed all the bottles inside. If he bothered to come around, I'd give him a piece of my mind. After doing some tidying up, I was getting hungry. I pulled the fridge open to look for any leftovers. As I was rummaging through the fridge, I saw an empty gallon of milk all the way in the back. Strange. I had just bought 2 full gallons of milk last week. I had an idea of who the culprit was. Alan had more than his share of my milk, and I did all the shopping. How does one dude go, though, a whole gallon of milk in one day? I had barely even drank a sip of it, and it was full before he got here. I closed the fridge instead and passed on eating. Alan really had some fucking nerve. When Alan wasn't gone, he'd either be on the couch sleeping, making horrible, snoring sounds, or he'd be downing an entire bottle of Hennessy and hogging the television. On many occasions, I'd have to sit him down and talk to him about having proper roommate etiquette, and told him if he didn't clean up his act, I'd send him on his merry way. But what really grinded my gears was that he never paid the rent. He made up excuses, like getting his paycheck late or his ex begging him for money. He always had a reason why he couldn't put down his share. I understood the first couple of times, but I became increasingly upset at his lack of fulfilling any real responsibility. It was stressing me out, and I was considering giving him the boot. To this day, I'm kicking myself for having put up with him for so long. I was such a dumb kid back then. Sadly, things started to escalate. While I was in my room playing video games one day, Alan barged in. He slammed the door so loud the whole place shook, and it startled me. He stumbled inside, barely able to keep his balance. I helped to steady him, but he almost fell over me. I dragged him onto the couch. Alan had bruises and scratches on his face. His lips and nose were bleeding, and he had a black eye. He reeked of booze and weed. He tried saying something, but I could barely make out what he was trying to communicate, as he was slurring his speech. His expression really freaked me out. His eyes were drooping, and the saliva was dripping from his mouth. I needed to know what the hell was going on, but I didn't think I was going to get much out of him. Whoa, buddy, you look messed up. You get in a bar fight. I bet it was pretty rough. Shit. Maybe you should get cleaned up or something, man. You look like hell. I said both in a joking and concerned manner. Alan only mumbled. He tried to stand up, but it was obvious he was in no condition to do so. So I forced him back and told him I'd get him some water. I poured some from the sink and went over to give him the cup, but Alan was already up from the couch and texting on his phone. He looked up at me and I saw that he was getting anxious. He was sweating and ran his fingers through his greasy brown hair like he was in some sort of trouble. Hey man, you gotta loan me some money. I need it real bad. I owe a couple hundred. I'm in a bind right now. You gotta understand, man. I could get messed up even worse. He was panicking. It almost looked like he was about to cry. I tried to calm him down, but Alan was becoming more and more agitated. I could sense that he was tensing up. I was even getting scared. He might have been a drunken zombie, but he could blow a fuse at any second, and I didn't want to be anywhere near him if it came to that. Alan started to curse loudly, and he smashed a bottle on the wall. I yelled at him to knock it off, but at this point he was in a reptilian state and just kept on smashing more and more bottles. I didn't know what to do. I'd be out of my mind if I tried to fight him. He was larger than me. Sure, I worked out, but my strength paled in comparison to his own. He'd probably twist me into a pretzel. Instead, I just ran back into my room and locked myself inside, hoping he'd tire himself out. Eventually, I heard the slamming of the door. Alan left. There was broken glass everywhere. I had to be careful not to step on any. He had gone completely insane, and who knows what he'd do to me if he ever went off like that again. I immediately picked up everything. It took hours, but I managed to make my apartment almost spotless, except for the permanent stains of booze on the carpet. Soon after, I called Dale to explain what went down. He brushed me off and said Alan just needed to let some steam off and not to worry so much. He didn't understand the gravity of the situation with Alan, and we went back and forth with each other until I just hung up. I couldn't believe Dale could be friends with a jackass like that. I almost wondered if Alan got Dale to start drinking because it only started to happen by his junior year of high school. Dale was a straighter student, but once he started hanging out with Alan and his crew, his grades started slipping, and he even got to his classes late. Alan was a bad influence from the beginning, and it's sad to see how he turned out. I didn't see Alan for the next few days. I was still shaken up about the incident. I thought of buying myself a handgun in case he posed himself as a threat. But more than anything, I wanted to get him help as he was spiraling and he had a disease, and that disease was alcoholism. Dale came by the apartment. We sat a day down to talk, and during our conversation he brought up Alan. He's been buying drugs from his dealer. I really didn't want to tell you he was a junkie, man. I figured maybe if I didn't say anything you'd give him a chance. He's been through a lot, and he's trying to get better. It took a while for me to say anything back. I was mad that Dale kept very important details about Alan from me, but arguing with him over it wasn't the solution. Dale may have not picked the best sort of friends, but he genuinely did care. It was just unfortunate I had to see Alan's addiction firsthand and how it was wrecking his life. Before he took off, he had scratches and bruises on his face like he had been in a fight, and the guy was pretty nervous, like, I don't know. He must be in some serious trouble, probably with his dealer. Dale only shrugged his shoulders. If anybody knew why Alan was behaving so jittery, it had to be Dale. He was close enough with him that he could give me a straight answer, but I don't know that Dale wanted to blab Alan's business to me just because we were related. I did have a right to know, though. If Alan came back, we'd both need to send him to a rehab facility. I don't know. I haven't really talked to him much. He's been blowing me off a lot lately. Says he had to meet someone. Wouldn't tell me who. I didn't even know how he was getting dope like that. I always thought he only drank. Man, that explains him being real weird around me for that past year. Dale and I talked for another few hours until he left and told me he'd try getting a hold of Alan. I doubted we'd hear from him for days. I was beginning to think he went missing, but if he had left of his own volition, then we couldn't report him missing. There was a chance he might have taken his own life, and if so, no one would have been there to stop him. Alan's ex showed up to my apartment a few weeks later. It was a Friday morning, and I had heard a loud banging and shouting on the other side of the door. She was looking for Alan, but she'd only find his roommate, who wouldn't be able to give her any explanation of his sudden disappearance. She busted inside once I opened the door. She called out his name several times. She was going on about his lazy ass owing her money. I told her he wasn't here and that she'd have to come back some other time. You tell that son of a bitch I want the rest by Monday. If I don't get it, I'll take all his shit and sell it, she said in a very matter-of-fact tone, and spun around and walked out, slamming the door hard behind her. Boy, I wonder just how much he owed her and how he'd be able to help me pay the rent and pay her back. Alan finally came back the following Tuesday. I found him slumped on the coach, but when he saw me, he instantly perked up, and then he shook me by the shoulders. I tried to push his hands off, but he had a strong grip. Alan looked absolutely mad. He was on the verge of having a total mental breakdown. He looked even worse than the last time I had seen him, like he had gotten a beating with a bat or something. I finally managed to break free of his grip, and when I did, he started sobbing. He's after me. He's gonna find me. If he finds me, I swear to God he'll kill me. I swear this time he'll do it, Alan said through sobs. Whoa, who's going after you? What the hell does he want? You've got to snap out of it, Alan. You need help, man. You're gonna get us both killed. Alan was rocking back and forth and fidgeting his fingers like crazy. I Saturday down next to him trying to console him. I was no therapist, but I had enough sympathy to at least show some support even, though I was afraid and didn't want to get involved in what could be a very deadly conflict. Is it your drug dealer, Alan? Do you owe him? Alan was a bit calmer now, but he still struggled to compose himself. Yeah, it's him. I told him I didn't have enough. I told him I needed more time. Guess he got tired of waiting. He came around with some buddies of his. They beat the shit out of me. I couldn't fight 'em, man. It was 5 of them. I put my arm around his shoulder. I didn't know what to say in the moment. I just knew that I wanted to be here for him. Even if we weren't friends, I didn't have any genuine hate for Alan, despite him being a lousy roommate with drug and alcohol problems. He talked a while longer before I began to hear loud voices coming from just outside the apartment, and we both went silent and stared at the door. I got up and rushed to peek out the window to see who was making all that commotion. I saw 2 large men wearing beanies and black leather jackets and wearing dark shades. They stood together like security guards. I slowly backed up from the window. Those were probably some of the guys that beat up Alan, and somehow they found him here. Hey Alan, we've got company. It's got to be those guys you were talking about. You think we can keep them from coming inside? How'd they even get through the gates? I looked over at Alan. He pulled out a small pocket knife from his pocket and struck it out in front of him as though he was getting ready for a brutal knife fight. I'd never seen any sort of fight before, and I definitely didn't want to be in the middle of a brawl. One of them lives here. He's the one who told me I could move in with him before I met you. We used to hang around, you know. Not super close, but I didn't know he had ties with my dealer. Told me where I could get weed for cheap. I blew all my money on booncy and weed. I've been broke ever since. Man, this feels like some crazy-ass setup, I said. Alan inched himself closer to the door, gripping the knife with both of his hands. He reminded me of a greaser from a 50s flick, the way he carefully made a sidestep motion with his legs. I could see the 2 men staring through the window. One of them pressed their face to the window pane and banged on it with his fist. I could hear him shouting, though the shouts were muffled, but they were definitely looking for Alan, but they hadn't seen him yet. I figured maybe they'd go away, but I heard more banging against the door and multiple shouts. Look, bro, go get inside your room. Call the cops. I'll try holding them off. I'll make sure they don't get in. I did as he told me and bolted to my room. I quickly dialed 911 and told the operator there were 2 men trying to break into my apartment. While I was on the phone, I heard rapid gunfire. I got down near my bed. I heard continuous gunshots go off in the distance. After a moment, I slowly got up and made my way to the window to see 3 other men standing around at a corner across the street. They were all holding large rifles that were aimed at the unit where I was, but the bullets had hit the gate, and soon they began to walk across the street to the complex and reloaded their weapons and continued to fire even more shots at the units above mine. I ducked back down, hoping they hadn't seen me. I could feel tears streaming down my face. How was Alan going to fight them all off? He'd be dead before the cops arrived, and I'd probably be dead too. The two other men kept shouting and banging outside. They were trying to get Alan to come outside. I locked myself in my room. I hoped that maybe they would take it out onto the streets and they could all just get arrested by the cops. I wasn't sure how long Alan could hold them off. They were getting relentless, and it sounded like they'd bust down the door, with their combined strength like two giant bulls running headfirst into a wall. I felt too paralyzed to move, but I crawled slowly to the door of my bedroom and pressed one ear against it. I could hear Alan screaming for them to go away. I didn't dare open the door for fear they had guns of their own. We were both trapped in my apartment, and each second that went by I was tempted to call my parents and tell them I'd probably never see them again, or Dale. I began to cry silently. My tears flowed down my cheeks, and I waited to brace myself for the worst. I wiped away my tears and looked around my room to see if there was anything I could use that would be enough to inflict serious injury. Instead of standing up, I continued to crawl away from the door to begin searching for anything I could use. I tore through my drawers and closet, tossing out everything that was inside until I came across a mallet. I quickly snatched it up and made a quick dash out my room, but when I stepped out, I saw Alan swing the door wide open and run right, past the two men, but not before they wrestled him to the wrong and started punching him. One of them grabbed him by his shirt collar, and they both dragged him backwards. He was unconscious and bleeding profusely from his nose and mouth. Once they disappeared from my view, I followed after them. My neighbors also began to come out to see what was going on. They all looked in my direction and started to surround me and ask me questions, but I ignored them and brushed past. I heard multiple sirens coming from a couple blocks away. They surrounded the entire complex. Many of the tenants went back inside, but I ran to the front of the complex, and what I saw next has forever stuck with me. The men and Alan were outside on the sidewalk, and they were kicking him and stabbing him. My heart practically sank to my stomach. They were going to kill him right there and then. I could see the blood from his body pouring out, causing a huge puddle around him. It was a sickly sight that made me want to vomit. There was just no way they'd leave him alive, and I couldn't do anything. They'd only beat me to death with the mallet I had. It would be up to the police now to stop them. And I could see the blue and red lights peeling down the road to get to my street, along with ambulances rushing behind. As soon as the cops were on my street, they rushed out of their cars and shot off several rounds of gunfire. The bullets struck one of the men in the back, and I saw him fall to his knees and then drop to the ground with a hard smack. The other men stopped as more bullets were fired and ran off in different directions, but not before they were tackled to the ground and put into handcuffs and thrown into the back of a police van. A group of medics carried Alan's body and put him on a stretcher and drove him to the nearest hospital. A cop came up to me and began to ask me questions. "Son, did you know that man?" "Yes, he was a friend. He said someone was going to kill him. He owed money, a lot of money." The cop started jotting down some notes and asked me further questions. I tried my best to answer, but I could feel my tears rushing down my cheeks. I just couldn't believe Alan was so hooked to the dope that it cost him his life and nearly mine. And this was the price he had to pay for falling into debt. But after today, I didn't care about him owing me anything, but even if he survived his wounds, he wouldn't be staying with me anymore. Unless he changed his life around, and this ordeal served as a wake-up call, he could forget about ever having a stable living situation. The rest of the day I lay in bed. I put my phone on Do Not Disturb and just drifted off to sleep. As the hours became later and later, I was met with disturbing nightmares, all related to the men attacking Alan. They were all so vivid. I could see them pumping bullets into his body and repeatedly taking blows with their fists like they were hitting a piñata. All of it was awful, and it turned into a recurring nightmare that lasted for several weeks, causing me to have restless nights. I developed depression and PTSD. I shut myself off from the world and barely left my apartment. I didn't bother with work or school, and by that point I was going to move back in with my parents. They had no problem taking me back in, but what really hurt the most was losing my newfound independence that had been short-lived. Dale apologized for having suggested Alan as a roommate, but for all of his faults and obvious addiction, neither of us could have predicted what went down, and Dale was only doing his buddy a favor after all. Alan was in critical condition and had to be put on life support, but was discharged from the hospital. He sustained multiple wounds in his stomach and arms, but thankfully none of the stabs hit critical arteries, but he had lost a lot of blood. As for the other men, they all ratted out his dealer, but were all sentenced to serve time in prison for attempted murder and drug possession. Alan did end up going to rehab. He really had no choice. I ended up leaving the state entirely, and eventually I bought my first home, after I picked up a job working with people who suffer with substance abuse. I guess I wanted to make a difference in people's lives, so at least I was able to make a career from someone who had an addiction. I had to learn to forgive Alan as well. These days I'm doing much better. I still get nightmares now and then, but I'm mostly back to normal. I don't know what's become of Alan, but I hope he's sober now. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.